FinTechTalk, the live webinar with no presentations, no PowerPoint, just talk.
Hello and welcome to FinTech Talk. I'm your host, Charles Orton-Jones. Today we're looking at a subject most financial organizations do extremely badly, KYC, Know Your Customer. The idea for this came from a FinTech Times article recently that looked at just how incompetent banks are at KYC. Let's read you a couple of statistics from this. I think it really illustrates the real horror show of current KYC. Most organizations are still relying on manual processes. Yes, they are, in the age of AI. We're looking at banks taking an average of 95 days to complete a KYC check. That is 3 months. Looking at the expense, costs have soared to $2,500 a time, which is ridiculous. And we found that 48% of banks say they have lost customers because of their poor quality KYC processes. So what should you be doing? To find out, we've done what we always do, which is scour the globe for the ultimate experts in the subject to give you a rapid briefing into what really is the cutting edge answer to this problem. So without further ado, let me introduce our two panelists today who really have more experience in this area than anyone else we could find or think of. So our first panelist, Payal, if you could switch your camera on. May I welcome Payal Sarkar, who spent 15 years working in KYC. Payal, perhaps you could just tell everyone watching just a little bit about your background in KYC, because you really are an expert and specialist in this, aren't you?
Sure. Thank you, Charles. Hello, everybody. I'm Payal Sarkar. Currently working as a transformation and advisory head for Society Generale, based out of Bangalore, India. I've previously been with HSBC in the KYC space around commercial banking, global banking and markets, and retail. Pretty much, done all of the aspects of reviews, remediations, onboarding, and the entire Jim Sham, let's just say that. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself. Charles, back to you.
So good. You know it all. That's what we want to hear. And our second panelist is Howard Wimpery. Howard is KYC Transformation Director at Encompass Corporation, which is one of the world's leading specialists in KYC. Howard, if you could switch your camera and microphone on. Howard has spent 4 decades with Barclays in a variety of roles, and now he helps global tier 1 banks with the Encompass platform move from sort of manual processes, messy processes, to the world's most cutting-edge system. So Howard, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here, Charles. Great. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Thank you.
So good. Well, Howard, if I could just ask you first. I mean, I read out some of those statistics from FinTech Times, and we tend to assume that today banks and financial organizations have, mastered automation. They've got AI everywhere. They've got slick processes. But these stats are just dire. I mean, come on. Banks taking 3 months to produce KYC, mostly manual processes. I mean, Howard, how bad is it? And what do banks and financial organizations get wrong when it comes to KYC?
Okay, so I'll start with a bit of perspective here. And I'm able to speak on both sides of the table because I'm now a vendor selling into those banks. And you would think, and I've also administered that process. So I've been guilty of that as charged for all those stats that have come out in that report you were just quoting. It's not an oversimplification to say the subject is highly complex. So moving from this current state of manual to an automated process is one that everybody wants to be able to make, but there's a good deal of inertia that has to be overcome before you can start that process. So I don't think anybody from a bank that I certainly speak to across the globe will ever think that my manual process is great and I'm proud of it. It often is good enough. It ticks the regulatory things. So they're not getting whacked for doing the wrong job in the main. And they know that there is a better way of doing it, but getting to that better way of doing it is a big step. You need lots of courage. You need lots of senior oversight to be able to, and consistent funding to be able to enable you to make the change. I would advocate, because I work for a vendor, that the technology that is now available means that it's quite possible that people should be making that step towards automation.
Sure. Just tell me about that word inertia. Why are people so reluctant to upgrade KYC? Because we've seen that delays are ridiculous. Half of banks are losing customers due to slow onboarding. Zero in on that word inertia, because I think it really sums it up.
Well, it's a highly complex process. There's no doubting about that. And it's a process which has hitherto always been manual. I mean, I can remember in the early 90s when KYC became a thing. Up until that point, it wasn't. You just had a friendly bank manager that knew you and it was all okay.
Yeah.
That's how it used to be. And then at every stage over the last 3 decades, there have been more and more regulation that's been responded to by manual process. And actually, there's this cat's cradle now of process and regulation that's been woven together. And it's actually incredibly complex to start unpicking it without the whole thing collapsing. So there is a view, a bit like, if you've got a house that's not falling down, why start meddling with something that isn't broken?
Sure. And Payal, perhaps you could just tell us what it's like working in KYC, because some people will be watching this and they'll be thinking, well, it's a pretty straightforward thing, isn't it? I mean, you just follow a few procedures and Bob's your uncle. But it is, as Howard said, an actually pretty complicated subject. Just give us a clue as to all the different skills you need to work in KYC.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, like Howard said, it is extremely complex. And while I don't know or I've not been on the vendor side of things, I can tell you from a bank's perspective, it takes a lot for us to understand and get through the entire processing, which is very complex, have multiple regulations at every stage. And the kind of skill sets that we generally are looking for are for people to be able to look at details and identify the red flags. While it is very easily said, it's not easily done at all. When we are scavenging through a number of documents and a number of parties, connected parties that are acquainted to every profile, individual profiles are probably a little bit easier that way. But overall, it becomes quite a task to be able to pick out look at every minute detail and then be able to match them to each other and then come up with where exactly is the missing link. And today, I think one of the biggest issues or challenges with KYC still remains the fact that the record keeping, the data availability is still a challenge. Yes, we have AI. Yes, we have all the blockchain solutions, but false positives are a reality, and they still continue to be a challenge for most banks. The inability to be able to be consistent at all stages is probably what is one of the major challenges, along with the cost aspects that continuously keep growing, considering that we have more and more regulations that need to be met.
Okay. Now, what I'd love is to tell our viewers how they can modernize. So perhaps, Howard, you're the specialist in KYC transformation. So perhaps you could just start. So when someone gets in touch and says, God, we've got manual processes, they're expensive, they haven't been improved in 20 years. What is your first step with a client? What happens?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing is to stress the incremental nature of the transformation that they need to be considering. I think, and to dissuade them of any sort of silver bullet, big bang approach that can revolutionize their 3-decade-old process and convert it into something dream state in one go. That's just not. It's not sensible and it's not possible. So what I tend to advise my clients to do is to consider the early adoption of some automation software, then a middle state, and then a final state, because that allows you to build an increment without blowing the ship up, and making sure that the various components that you need to bring together to make it work are actually built in a way that ecosystem hangs together and builds trust as it goes. So incremental is the first point. The second point really is about is to break down the issues that you're trying to trying to automate into probably 3 big categories. And I'd recommend starting with data as being the first one. Payal's already mentioned the huge amount of data that needs to be considered. And my recommendation when dealing with this subject on an automation journey is to work out what is it that you actually need and which data drives KYC risk identification. And that's it's not a deliberately oblique point. It is to say, have we got the right data today, or have we perhaps got too much? My experience was that with every new regulation came new data requirements, new data, and we're just building on. And I think an approach which I've seen work very successfully at some of the global banks that I've worked with is to actually strip that right back to the bare bones and build it back up again, rather than assume that what you've got today is what you need tomorrow. So point two, don't automate what you've got. Make sure that you've really considered the data set that you need before you start to automate that, because otherwise you're just going to be automating a lot of white noise, which isn't necessary. So a measured approach that means you consider before you start acting is a good thing. And then once you've considered that data point, the second point is about introducing those components that you need to make your ecosystem of KYC work. And typically those pieces are the following. There's a data searching and beneficial ownership discovery component, and that's something which Encompass, the firm I work with, that's our speciality. There is a workflow system known as a customer lifecycle manager, a CLM platform. That is another key component of that. Now, you can buy those off the shelf, or you can build them yourself. Depends what your habitat is with each particular bank. They choose to build, sometimes they buy. I think most people are buying these days. It's a special subject, and one which is easier to buy off the shelf. And then once you've got your data and your workflow, then you need to build some other critical components that really will start to drive some automation. Those other critical components include things like data entity resolution. So that is working out, have you got the right data point? And when you're comparing it to an existing one, has it changed? And how material that changes. If you get those components built together and integrated with one another, then you start to position yourself for full-scale automation at a later date. And typically
that's a really
that
good
journey
overview.
could take up to 3 years.
Okay, thanks so much. Pal, let's just have a look at this concept of data, because we've certainly seen with across KYC and anti-money laundering, there's potentially a sort of limitless source of data that could be used. I've heard of organizations using social media, LinkedIn, even Instagram, I've heard being sourced. So Pal, perhaps you could just tell us about the broad variety of data that you use for KYC, and what do you think is relevant, and what can you see being used in the future?
In terms of data, let's first agree that what Howard said about a lot of data being available is an absolute reality. And over the years, most banks have actually put together so much data that it's at times quite tricky to be able to understand what you need to strip down and where you need to really hold on and build on. And that is why the entire concept of perpetual KYC, the eKYC systems that have now come into play are extremely important, because that means banks have actually had to strip everything down and then look at a risk-based approach to identify what are those elements that really drive the risk of a customer, and then be able to build something that is efficient. Now, while we want to believe that it can be 100% efficient, probably not, but at the max, what we can definitely do is to be able to identify those key aspects and ensure that the key parts are being looked at on a regular basis. So some of the remediations now have become, probably most banks have gone through that phase. Now we are looking at reviews and triggers and pieces like what Howard was touching upon in terms of an entire end-to-end system, which kind of integrates everything together. Those are the aspects that today are more relevant. The AI blockchain solutions that we have in place, which are readily available off the shelf, usage of real-time data exchange to ensure that some of the false positives can be taken off the shelf, are some of the aspects that are very, very key for us to keep looking at these data items to be clean, most importantly, because that's where one of the major challenges lie.
And what new data sources are you using? I mean, I was talking to a buy now, pay later lender who said when they come to trying to verify customers, they're using more than 100 different sources of data. And some of them were quite arcane. I mean, yeah, they were looking at stuff like Instagram posts. Is this a real person? Because they were scratching their head and thinking, generative AI, is it possible to create a fake identity, spin up a LinkedIn profile, spin up a quick, couple of Facebook things?
I wish not.
What do you
Banks
think?
are doing Instagram searches. Not something that's a reality today.
Right.
But yeah,
Okay.
banks definitely don't. While some of our platforms and some of the known vendors like Bloomberg, etc., are still a reality and they provide the best information. But going into Insta kind of stuff is probably still not something that we look at. But having said that, who knows in the future? But as of today, it's not really a very liable and viable source.
But I can ask you, with KYC, obviously you're trying to track down, bad actors or red flags. What are the trends there? What are you catching? Are people just creating a fraudulent identity and trying to open an account? What is the main thing that you're looking out for?
Well, it will be difficult to point out one or two of them, but majorly what we see as red flags are mostly the disconnects that you find between beneficial ownerships and the different ownership structures, which are quite well-known factors that still play around. We do see a lot of country involvements where you have, especially in the compliance areas, where you have trade involved, you have a lot of trade products that go with the profile. That becomes a little tricky when you have vessels moving around, especially in large corporate environments. Individuals, like I said, are a little bit easier to pinpoint issues or concerns, but there also you do find a few verification issues that come through. Or handovers that have not properly been documented. The documents are probably old age, they are backdated, out of date, needs to be looked at whether they are still relevant or not. Because with our regulations being updated, thankfully today we have a certain timelines that are attached to a document being viable and acceptable. That has to a large extent, in many ways, simplified the way we do KYC. And those are still coming into the picture and do help the overall process of making it a little faster.
Great. Howard, I can see out this corner of my eye, something's resonating here.
Yes,
what are your thoughts on what Payal just said?
Yes, so I think it's a really good point that Payal's making. I think the way that I view it, and certainly the resonance amongst the clients that we're working with is that, excuse me, at onboarding, there is a limit to how far you can really prove the bona fides of a company. There are sources you can go to, but let's be clear, you can establish shell companies relatively quickly and relatively easily across the globe. Even in my home regulated market of the UK, Companies House is full of companies that really don't pass the sniff test. So as a company presents itself at onboarding, there's a limit to what you can do. The real efficacy of a bank's KYC system really comes into play once the client starts transacting, because there is a way, as I say, you can present yourself as being a bona fide organization, but my focus is on organizations. You can present yourself as being bona fide at the outset, but it's how you behave that is critical to the risk that client manifests itself to the bank. So banks being able to quickly identify changes, unexpected changes in behavior relative to what they were at onboarding is a really important control that they have. Now, typically that can be done in a manual sense. That was something which banks were able to categorize their clients by risk and then schedule for a review, which is entirely manual. And those reviews could span over up to a 5-year period. Technology now enables those reviews to happen in near time. And that's one of the critical turns of the screw for flushing out bad actors, is that you can now detect people much more quickly than ever before, because the technology and the data availability, should you be able to curate it in the right way, enables you to detect things which look out of place. I think that's where KYC and anti-money laundering and fraud detection have to come together to be able to flush out those bad actors.
Yeah,
Pyle,
correctly,
I can
Howard.
see you wanted to add to that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, sure. So Howard correctly mentioned a large part of the trigger reviews piece that today banks follow is very much concentrated on this topic of seeing where the behavior has changed or some of the important aspects of a customer's profile has changed, which immediately asks for a review to be done depending on what kind of information has changed. Is it the country, the address, the entire documentation, handover, a takeover, a merger? Some of those aspects really become red flags, which cause these trigger reviews to be conducted, which doesn't have to wait for the 5-year, 3-year period basis the risk of the customer. But the moment we have such a behavior, banks can catch them and quickly take a look without doing a full KYC and investing the entire time for the entire source to happen, and quickly just address the change that has taken place. So I think that has been one of the very, very important developments in the KYC world.
Great. May I ask, I mean, it's all very well having banks having slick systems, but of course they have to interface with other systems, including government systems, things like Companies House. And we know in the UK, our government is really patchy about modernising systems. I mean, our health service still uses fax machines. So may I ask, Pyle, to what degree is it a bottleneck that a bank can have slick systems, but they need all the counterparties to have interoperable systems, API-ready systems? So just tell us about the external environment you have to deal with. It must be highly varied.
It does at times get a little tricky, especially if the data is not completely available. But let's also understand that there are, while we have the government sources, especially in UK, it's a little more easier that way. Some of the other countries, you don't have up-to-date information as much easily available. But you still have to go and cross-verify that with the documentation that's available, and at some of the other systems that the banks use if they are talking to each other. Negative news search, screening overall process takes a large part of the overall KYC journey. A big part of that timeline is taken away through the negative news search and the other screenings that are conducted. And that is where these data mismatches or things that are not updated probably in one source kind of show up in another source. And that is where the time is consumed to a large extent to be able to tally and see which is acceptable and which is not really.
Great. Howard, you're nodding away.
Yes, absolutely right. I think that the way in which banks deal with the statement, which is absolutely spot on, you made, Charles, which is not all data is available to the same standard across the globe. So therefore, you have to have a risk-based approach to it. And that corroboration of data points is how most banks tend to deal with this. It is complex. If I just take, just a couple of examples that off the top of my head about the way in which different, the equivalents of Companies House put themselves. You've got the equivalent in Singapore, for example, operates almost exactly the same as the Companies House does, with data freely available for extract by API, and then the other registries around the world, there is zero API connectivity. The only way you can get data is to download a document and then to read it. And all of that adds to the complexity and the pace at which an onboarding or a refresh case goes, which speaks to the point you made in your opening about why it takes so long and why the cost is so high. And emerging technologies are now starting to be able to reliably extract data from documents. I think that is another one of those little catalyst moments that is starting to enable the full automation journey to go ahead. Because again, hitherto, some data was available through API, some wasn't. The only option was to download a document and read it and now extract it by human eye. And now that human eye piece is on the verge of being removed. It's not totally removable, but the technology is there that enables that step to happen. So that's just another example of the incremental change that can be addressed, where banks have got the appetite to adopt that.
But can you just talk us, you mentioned there are kind of 3 steps, easy, medium, hard.
Yeah.
Just give us a clue as to what different activities are included under those different umbrellas. And I'm particularly interested in what is the most difficult thing in KYC. Perhaps you just give us an idea as to how it all breaks up into easy, medium, and hard.
The easiest piece is about the decision about which data attributes you value that drive change, and sourcing and automating the delivery of those. That's the sweet spot of Encompass. That's probably the easiest thing for a bank to start with. Then another really tricky thing is actually, well, what's the entity that we're actually referring to? And certainly in the corporate space, where a global bank will have transactions for the same corporate going on across multiple sites. Actually, the bank to have a single view of that client, which is a single record, which is accessed by all parts of that organization across the globe, is actually incredibly difficult. You would think that if you're building a bank today, that's how you'd start. But these banks are often started by merger, by acquisition, etc. And therefore, data isn't always curated equally. So that internal data management requires a huge amount of work to get that into really good order. I would say that internal data is probably the most complex part of the process. And then once you've got that going into a curated and organized way, then the last part of the puzzle is relatively straightforward in terms of technology, but there is a massive trust issue that needs to be built up over time and performance of parallel running. And that is the ability for technology to run a change assessment against the original client record against a refreshed one. So to be able to do that methodically and consistently is something that builds a lot of trust. The technology is there to do it. And then to identify any changes that are there and the materiality of those changes is probably the last step in the process, which is where a lot of trust needs to go, because there's an inherent trust in human beings reviewing a file. As complex and as cumbersome and slow as it all is, inherently we trust a human to do that accurately. When it comes to technology doing it, it takes a long time for people to trust the machinery to do it as proficiently. Now, there's plenty of use cases that suggest that actually we should be much more inherently trusting of the technology, but fundamentally, banks need to be able to explain the technology to a regulator. And if they have any misunderstanding or any gap in their knowledge about how it works, then actually adopting that technology is going to be very difficult for them, because they have to sit in front of the regulator and explain how they match the regulatory requirements. And pointing to the way they do that today is to point to a nice policy document that converts to desk procedures and some control outcome statements. That's how it's been done before. And there's a well-trodden path to do that. If you were to start a conversation that says, oh, we use generative AI here and this there and some machine learning over there, that is going to elicit questions that have never been asked of that organization before, and they have to be certain. So, and we see the more enlightened organizations and regulators encouraging that change of behavior now, because the regulators, they realize that today's KYC, which is slow, manual, blah, blah, isn't the most effective way of managing the risk. What they do, however, require is for the banks to understand the new risks that come with new technology. They need to be able to manage that. But they are encouraging them, and in our experience, they're asking, what are you doing about new technologies? AI is probably the catch-all phrase that's used at the moment. And there's an expectation from regulators that the organizations should be adopting it. How they adopt it is the important thing.
Payal, what do you make of that? And I'd just like to also ask you, Payal, about the most cutting-edge thing that you're engaged with at the moment. I'd love just to give you some insight into what is the most urgent and important thing on your desk at the moment. What project you're challenging that will take Société Générale to the next level?
First of all, just to tie back to what Howard was saying, it
Mm.
is important, and it's a reality that we have more and more small bits and pieces that come together to be, form the bigger puzzle and make it try and see if we can make it a little easier. That is the client lifecycle management systems that we are talking about. Somewhere they come together and make it a workflow system, which then gives the confidence over a period of time to say that it is giving us the results that we are looking at. While all kinds of these APIs, simple standing APIs and AI systems, they're probably today are all coming together in bits and pieces and trying to build it all together. It is also a reality that they have their own challenges because these are all significant individual things. Maintaining them, ensuring that their structure, the data that is being fed through that is also viable and is something that we can is reliable. So those are also challenges that continue to grow with the new things that come onto into this area of KYC. In terms of what is challenging, what looks like cutting edge, these days we talk a lot about biometrics. It's become a big thing these days. We are
Mm.
putting it all together now, mostly for individuals, or obviously corporates don't always get into it unless you're into the beneficial owner space. But it is also important to understand that such kind of personal data can also at times become an issue from a regulation standpoint, because a lot of countries are not able to share it amongst themselves. While it kind of helps in a lot of way in identification and verification processes of the KYC, but they bring in their own challenges because you cannot be sharing such data openly and widely across borders, and
Mm.
that itself is also a challenge by itself. Just as an example of some of the new things that come to us, they are promising, they do give results, but they do come with their own challenges that we have to deal with.
Another nosy question for you, Payal, is, I mean, this stuff's clearly very difficult. To what degree are you solving your KYC problems in-house, or are you buying solutions and various packages and sticking them together? Because we've seen banking, the build it, buy it, partner it equation shift over the years. And the idea of making everything bespoke in-house may be a little laborious. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so two thoughts on that. First things, I don't think there is one solution. You cannot buy everything, and neither can you make everything in-house. There has to be a combination of the two, because like you said, it becomes extremely laborious and it is repetitive, because a lot of good systems are available off the shelf that one can buy and use to simplify the process. So while some of the major elements and can be bought in with the vendors and get them engaged with us, there are also bits and pieces that are important to be built in-house, because the requirement of every bank differs from one to the other. While the regulations driving us is probably the same, but let's understand at the end of the day, we are doing all of this information to help our front end people who are going to bring us all the profits. So we have to ensure that we get them enough information and the right type of customers at information, so that it's beneficial and profitable at the end of the day. So there is no one solution. It's probably always going to be a combination of the two, and either one of them not functioning obviously does not help the overall puzzle that we put together. So it's kind of maintaining a balance between the two.
Cool. Thank you for those insights. And Howard, how do you see it? I mean, Encompass Corporation,
Yes.
do you market yourself as a one-stop shop, or are you partnering with people?
No.
How
I
does it work?
think the buyers that we target, they're way too wise for anybody that presents themselves as being the single solution is effectively laughed out of the meeting room, because it's just not credible. So no, we're very clear about our niche and we focus on that. But just to reiterate Payal's points, I think the build versus buy conundrum is one of personal choice. It comes down to a number of different things, risk appetite particularly, and the kind of the regulatory expectation of the regulator in their home market tends to drive a lot of their appetite. But I would say over time, we're seeing an increasing move away from build to buy. That's a viewpoint that I would take. But I think Payal's point is absolutely right. It's never going to end up in an extreme all or nothing. But I think I'm just starting to see the dial, and particularly with those new technologies, the people out there on the street have got this new technology, which the banks want to, in a Darwinian, way, stand on the shoulders of giants. They can get to that point much quicker than building it themselves.
Okay, my final question is how companies can assess where they are right now, because the people watching this will work for banks and financial organizations, and they'll think, well, maybe we're okay. How do people know if they're any good at this stuff?
Well, I think there's a couple of temperature tests. One, ask the front office how much they enjoy the onboarding process. Are they happy? Are they happy with the amount of outreach that goes on? Are their clients happy with the amount of outreach and friction that onboarding process happens? Are they happy waiting for the revenue to flow after 95 days, using that example? And I think the answer very quickly comes back with no one's content with it. I think then from an operational perspective, there's a lot of mind-numbing work that goes on. And the analysts that you mentioned the thousands of analysts that are employed, that whole colleague experience is something which really needs to be analysed. And you have to ask yourself, are analysts really analysing, or are they just collecting? And I think if you err on the collecting side rather than the analysing side, that's probably another call to arms to start that evolution of automation through those increments that I talked about.
Thank you. And Payal, how do you judge internally how well you're doing? I mean, do you have any sort of metrics or KPIs that you use?
All banks will have KPIs for their KYC processes to really understand, how long you're taking for the end-to-end journey, how long is each profile taking to complete the entire, the entire journey for either if it's onboarding, reviews, remediations, whichever. What is the kind of client satisfaction that you're looking at? What is the kind of quality that you're getting out of in terms of red flags that come out of it? Because a lot of times the data you're using, the tools you're using, the different APIs, connections, what is coming out of it? Are you getting some real red flags? Are you catching the right bad people, or they're all really false positives that are coming out at you? Those are probably some of the key aspects that most banks look at. But I'll completely agree with Howard to say that as the days are going by, in-house solutions are going less in number, and because we have obviously better ones that are available in the market that can be easily used, and they are less time consuming, that helps the overall process. But having said that, I don't think any bank, even as of today, would say they are content, because there is more to do. There is always going to be newer things that will come. There will always be ways to further simplify and make this a lesser time consuming journey overall, and of course less cost as well.
And 100% automation, is that an achievable goal?
Personally, my belief, not really. We will probably still require some human touch somewhere. And like Howard was saying, are our analysts really analyzing versus collecting is a very, very important aspect, because the work of a human brain is eventually to come and add that extra bit that maybe a machine could not identify or did not identify. So eventually there will be the need of the human eye for sure. How much is something that future will prove to us. By the day, we're getting better at finding systems that do a better job. But I think eventually we will need the human eyes to be there somewhere.
So now, Howard, final word to you. Encompass Corporation does advertise 100% automation in some cases.
Right.
What's your view?
100%
Is that a realistic
automation
goal?
of part of the process, let's be clear. So I think for the data gathering and the UBO, the UBO unwrapping, we can automate that 100%. The entirety of the process, I think, it's unrealistic to expect that we'll end up with a fully automated world. I think the move towards a tipping point where there is more exceptional processing by a human than the expected 100% today. So as time goes on, I think automation can start to auto-decision the majority of cases, and particularly those cases where no change is detected. You should expect that as an outcome, and fewer cases fall for human review. I think the human review is here to stay.
So good. Howard, Payal, you've given me an education. I hope our viewers have learned something too. I'll bet they have. This has been a real masterclass in KYC. We've covered it so completely and thoroughly. So thank you very much. Howard, Payal, thank you very much. And from me, Charles Orton-Jones and FinTech Talk, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.